Hello everybody, and a warm welcome to Shared Services linked in conjunction with Triangular World's first Masterclass. Today we are going to be running something where we get into some details around outsourcing. This is a Masterclass though, so we are looking to get into real detail here. We have 6 questions to go through, which we'll be putting to our panelists. We have a stellar cast of panelists to support what we're doing today, so I hope we'll get some real good nuggets of gold out of this. We would love you to participate as well and ask questions. We will hold them to the end of the panel piece of this presentation, and then we'll be asking them questions later. And you post your questions in the go-to webinar box that I think we've got a little example of what it looks like, so I'm sure you can all find that. This masterclass today goes on for an hour and 15 minutes, so keep your concentration. Right, so my name is Stephen Standring. I'm the Shared Services Link, and I'll be your chair today. And I'd like to welcome a global arrangement of people here today. Steve Koutros, who's the Managing Director of Delta Management Advisors and also a Triangular World Associate, and he is based in Rotterdam. Ed Hansen, a partner at Morgan Lewis and Bockius, he's in Detroit today. Leo Curran, who's SVP and Head of UK and Europe for EXL, who's in London. And Maureen Pichet, the Principal of the Hackett Group, who's in Philadelphia today. Right, so without further ado, it's worth just setting out what we're trying to achieve today. As an industry, the shared services world has got pretty good experience with outsourcing. However, in our experience, despite the fact that we've been doing this for 20 years, we often see contracts that are signed and deals that sometimes leave a bit of a bad taste. Sometimes they're set up very quickly, perhaps with less detail than necessary, and I'm pretty sure that everybody who's been through an outsourced contract has got some experiences that they would look back on and go, yeah, I think I would have changed that perhaps. I think we want to address some of these questions today to make sure that as you go forwards in your relationships that we can make them the best they can be, and that applies to also the outsourcers themselves, which is why Leah's on the panel, because they obviously want great partners and clients. It is important to know the do's and don'ts when entering into a partnership, so let's explore that in some detail. And let's go on to the first question, which I'm going to ask Maureen to kick off. What can you do during the RFP and selection process to minimize downstream issues and risks?
Great, thanks, Steve. Great question, and in your opening remarks, you even commented that a lot of times getting into these relationships and contracts can be pushed a little too quickly. So some of the things that we see can be done early on in the process to really help minimize some of the downstream issues. One is clearly don't rush the process. Finding the right partner and establishing that relationship that you're going to have for many years is really critical. And one of the most important things is really getting alignment internally about what it is that you expect your outcomes to be from this relationship. So internal alignment, critical, and also having your baseline. So understanding your current volumes, your metrics, your operating performance, etc. Really important to understand so that over the course of your relationship with your outsource provider, you really have a way to measure performance and improvements. I'd say from an RFP perspective, you really are looking for full transparency. So, take the time to really understand the delineation of roles, responsibilities, pricing, really get under the pricing mechanism, what's going to drive pricing changes over time, meaningful SLAs. What are those SLAs that really drive your business, and understanding how those are going to get measured. One of the challenges we see with relationships downstream is a lot of tools, technologies, and transformation is promised up front during the sales cycle. Not all of that comes to fruition. So making sure you really get under what exactly is being committed to and making sure that ends up in your contract. And then I guess my last comment on this would be, making sure you're really vetting the suppliers, because you're going to be in a relationship with these folks for quite some time, and you need to be able to work through through thorny issues with them. So vet the supplier, vet their capabilities, certainly do your due diligence through site visits, making sure you understand who's going to be servicing your account. And then also, we think it's really important to conduct client references because, Steve mentioned in his opening comments, kind of those lessons learned, what would I have done different? That's great information to get from other clients who have worked with those suppliers. Ed, any comments to add?
Well, yeah, I think that I have a couple. First of all, I think it really helps to think about what the contract really is in an outsourcing. Unlike other deals where when you're done with the deal, you can look at the contract and you really know exactly what you're buying. By their very nature, outsourcing contracts are incomplete. And what that basically means is, if you've ever done one of these, and even on a 3-year deal, it's very hard to predict exactly where things are going to be in 3 years. So your SOW, as an example, is going to be obsolete at some point. Now, does that mean that you don't do a really robust, SOW and your RFP doesn't have to have really detailed descriptions of services and what your requirements are? It really doesn't. What it means is that by going through that process, what you're actually doing is you're really learning how the parties are going to work together. So I tend to think of the RFP a little bit differently than a lot of other people do. A lot of people think of the RFP as a way to sort of compare apples to apples and be able to sort of pit vendors against each other and that kind of thing. I actually tend to think of the RFP as the first part of a process that is designed to form a high-performing team. So, by going through all of the process points that Maureen just talked about, what you're really doing internally is you're really aligning people internally so that when you get in front of the vendor and you're going to market, and when you go out to RFP, the customer really has to think of themselves as a vendor in a lot of ways, because what you're doing is you're actually selling your attractiveness as a customer out to the vendor community. So going through a good RFP process where you take the time to really understand how the parties align internally and you get all of that drafted in, really puts your best foot forward and makes you a much more attractive customer in the market. That's extremely important. Then as you're going through this RFP process, going through this sort of iterative process where you're negotiating a lot of the substantive issues that are going to present themselves later on in the contract, doing that at the RFP stage actually makes it so that you have the risk mitigators involved rather than just the risk allocators, meaning that the people who are involved at that point in time where you're going through the RFP process and you're defining your solutions and all of that, those are problem solvers. And it's best to have problem solvers solving problems rather than risk allocators trying to solve the problems. So as much of the sort of substantive issues are going to come down the pike when you're in the contract, you can move into the RFP as business terms, not as legal terms, not as a contract that's attached to the back of the RFP, but as honest to God's substantive business terms that come into the body of the RFP. The easier it's going to be when you get to contract. So I think the RFP, in a lot of ways, is one of the most misunderstood and one of the most overlooked value drivers in the entire process. If it's done as a pitting one vendor against the other, all it does is really mess up your relationship. If it's done in a constructive relationship building way, then it actually becomes the first prong in your change management process, and is very useful to getting a vendor online to be part of that high performing team when you actually get to the implementation of the outsourcing. Maureen, do you have anything that you want to add to that after those comments?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, but I also like being able to compare apples to apples. So I agree it's the beginning of building a relationship, but really being able to understand what's included in the pricing and what's not, because a lot of times downstream, clients assume there are things that we're going to be part of the deal that are not part of the deal, and that leads to some downstream issues. So I do like the apples to apples comparison.
Yeah, the only caveat that I would add to that is that a lot of times what I see clients do is they become. I agree that pricing is very important, But I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I think it's important to not have the vendors get into a situation where they're trying to guess what each other's pricing is going to be. In other words, when pricing is brought front and center at the very beginning, well, what I've seen happen is you tend not to see the full solutioning capabilities of the vendors. And, you can get back to the pricing after you have the solutioning down, but I wonder what your thoughts are about that, because you don't really want vendors sort of in a prisoner's dilemma where they're trying to outguess each other on how much of their solution they should show because they don't know how expensive they can get.
Actually, Ed, could we just bring Leo in quickly to answer that? As a man that's received, I think, thousands of RFPs, Leo, I'd be interested to see what your view is on what the good ones are about.
Well, there's been some very, very good points here. The one point I think we should all address is bringing in the vendors very, very early on into almost a workshop style engagement. Very quickly, open up and welcome aboard the vendors in those early rounds, even at the RFI round, where you can start to exchange culture, bit of personality. They can get to learn more about the personality of your organization, and very quickly you start to really help them understand, the vendors that is, about what you're truly seeking. It's more than just the price. We just talked about that. It's more than just the simple contract, the scope. It's about hopefully the longevity and the value creation in that contract. And when then you do move into that down selection process, you're bringing with you your down selected vendors who really do have a much, much better understanding of your organization and your objectives against your strategic plan. And you've lifted everything off the page and brought it to life. And I would say invest the time, if you possibly can, early on and throughout. Assist with Q&A around solutioning. There's no right or wrong answer in this. And what we're really aiming for is hopefully that the buyer ends up with 1, 2, possibly 3 really good solutions from which to pick the most risk mitigated and the best solution for their organization.
Okay, fantastic. That's great. Okay, moving on to question 2. I'm sure this is that question 1 is going to pull out a few questions from our audience at the end. But for now, we're going to go on to question 2, and that is, what does a deal strategy look like, and what are you happy to trade as part of that strategy? How do I manage a contract negotiation process elegantly and over a contained period of time? Steve, perhaps you could take that one.
Certainly, thanks, Steve. Yeah, this is a great question because I think the old saying is, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. I've tried to, at the very beginning of the RFP writing and moving forward with clients as well as with suppliers, if you look at what's called the term sheet or the Master Services Agreement, there's at least 66 different points on which you can determine what you want. So if I just take a simple one, what's the term that we want? 5 years, renewing options, well, take 12 plus 12. So it's actually a 7-year potential deal. Those are just 2 points. So if you don't have a position or an idea of what's important in that list of 66 different items, you're going to end up somewhere else. And all of a sudden, if you look and evaluate all those 66 points, you can develop from that a way to strategize and negotiate your contract from a business standpoint. Ed, who will be also commenting on this, Ed and I have a very similar position in the sense that many a time, especially the first-time outsourcers or people who are doing deals, captives and things like this, they'll bring in an outside law firm because their internal law people don't have enough knowledge about outsourcing contracting, nor does their procurement people. So they bring in an outside lawyer. And you can get 2 types of lawyers when you do this. One is the legal lawyer, and the other one is the business lawyer. Ed, fortunately, and I like it very much, is a business lawyer. So he understands what it takes to run a business, how the business gets run. And those are the things you focus on, the true legal aspects where you need the lawyer, for instance, intellectual property or limits of liability. Those things still have business decisions. Make your business decisions first, and then figure out how legal the negotiations are going to go. So take those 66 points. It's about moving the goalposts in the stadium to the midfield where you both agree. One other point, and I'm going to touch on this a little bit, which was back to question 1. The statement of work is an example of what you want done. You never want to tell suppliers how they should do it. That's their determination. But if you don't take the statement of work as a starting point of what you're currently doing, or rather a wish list of what you're doing, you're going to end up with pricing that's really not respective. It's not going to match. If you're trying to, as Maureen said, match apples to apples, you're not going to be able to do that. So part of your deal strategy is to be, the RFP is an exact mirror of what the supplier will give back to you. The quality of your RFP will be a mirror of what the supplier will give back to you. And that will help you in your deal strategy, and to Leo's point, about understanding your suppliers better and learning whose culture is more like yours, who you can work with, who you'd want on the team. And to early on say, you know, the transition manager you brought, and this is part of your strategy as well, to find the A team. You might hear that in some other questions today. But to help you do that, you need to learn the people. Some people run very antiseptic processes, which I'm against. There's got to be some roads, there's got to be some Chinese walls set up, but if the client and the suppliers don't get a chance to know each other, I don't know that you'll always end up with a win-win deal for both sides. So I think part of the deal strategy is also ensuring enough face time, not only in the negotiation room, but outside the negotiation room, maybe once or twice over a period of, say, 4 to 6 months of negotiations, once or twice to meet outside the negotiating room. Helps you get to understand what Leo mentioned, a feel for the supplier you're trying to bring. So having said that, I mean, Ed, do you have add-on comments to what I've said? Well, I haven't touched on actually the how to manage the contract over time.
Well, yeah, I think first of all, I couldn't agree more with a lot of the things you said. And by the way, thank you for what you said about the business lawyers versus versus contract lawyers. I think that's a pretty important point. But when I think about deal strategy and sort of to give people on the phone some stuff that they can just go back to sort of use right away, what I've found really helps is first of all, when you're drafting up the RFP, it's a very helpful thing to think about what your barriers to adoption are going to be, where you have places where you know that you can't do something yourself, all the places where you can see weaknesses in your ability as a customer to be able to deliver what you need to deliver back to the vendor to allow the vendor to be able to do their job. It's very helpful to really understand all of that going into the RFP process. What that does is that allows you to ask questions in the RFP around those issues that will allow the vendor, by the way, to tailor the services and tailor things like resources that they bring to be able to, to be able to supplement some of those weaknesses and some of those problems that you're going to have. Like I said earlier, the best part of the process to deal with those kinds of issues is in the RFP process, because that really shortens the contract. When you get to the contract, I want the contract to be really about language and not about issues, because all the important issues were dealt with before we got there. So I think that really helps to speed things up. The other thing is that by doing it this way, you cut down on low-value negotiations. And what I mean by that is, the entire quote-unquote legal part of the contract is extraordinarily important, but it's only extraordinarily important, if nothing else, if the rest of the deal doesn't work. Right? So if you look at something like a limitation of liability provision, limitation of liability provisions are used less than 0.5% of the time. Contrast that to your SLA provisions, which are used every single day. So, to spend a month negotiating a limitation of liability provision and then to have to brush over, things that people don't consider to be legal issues, which means that they don't really consider it to be, they kind of know it's part of the contract, but they don't really think of it that way, is really short-sighted. If you deal with that stuff up front, the process will go faster. A good example of that is, let's say, for example, that you're doing a deal where you're working with a client that is not going to be able to conduct good knowledge transfer. Maybe it's part of a divestiture, and the people that are going over don't have other people who actually have the expertise. Maybe you're in a very hostile environment where the people that have to do knowledge transfer are going to be very resistant to the deal. By knowing that as you're going into the RFP, it allows you to ask questions in the RFP around things like what kind of vertical knowledge does the vendor have? Do they have people who work for them who have actually been in-house, who have done this kind of work as a customer, not just as a vendor providing services. Have they ever managed this kind of thing? Those kinds of questions can be very important, because when you get to the contract, those are all contract terms that you're going to need to be able to mitigate this risk that you have. If you have that dealt with from a business perspective before you get into the contracting, the contract then just becomes around the language that expresses what you've already agreed to, and that becomes a problem to solve in the RFP process, and you get to see how people solve problems together, which is actually much more important than almost anything else. Julio, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I do, and so much good value here, but I would just make one or two comments just to add to this. Negotiations nowadays tend to have a lot of pace. They're very rapid, and perhaps we've all got a little bit better, and we're able to be succinct where it will do, and we're able to pick the points that we have to be more detailed in. I think perhaps there's a bit more respect from both sides of the table. But it's essential to maintain that pace, and to do that, we must have access to the key decision makers, either in the room or on the end of a telephone. But going back to Steve's point at the top of this question, that will come to nothing if the preparation hasn't been invested in the first place on both sides of the party, buy side and sell side. If the prep is done, then we can work through to the sort of almost single-digit number of deal breakers, as we sometimes call them, which are still overcome, and we can work through them. And then let's not neglect the fact that if you have, on the buy side, invested in a relationship with a third-party advisor, some great experience out there, one of the big firms or one of the more boutique firms or single person firms, let's keep them in and maintain them in the room, and let's make sure that they sit across both parties to make sure that with that pace and preparation, the decision makers available and accessible, we deliver. I'm not so sure it's always elegant, but we deliver on time. And I think if you know very quickly when a deal is just going in the wrong direction, as was described, when it just slows down and you're just breaking every deadline, because the spirit of the discussions and negotiations is lost.
Fantastic.
That's all I would say.
Yep, thank you, Leo. Okay, moving on to question 3. How effective is your governance program at managing the partnership and optimizing outcomes, focusing on the stuff people aren't talking about? And that's, I'm going to pass over to you, Leo, for that one.
Sure. How effective is your governance program at managing the partnership and optimizing outcomes? Look, in many cases it works very, very well, but where we see this being derailed, if you like, or just not being as effective is, and it comes down to, it almost sounds like a platitude, but it's about the people. People deliver good governance. It's about the early stages of the program, making sure that people are energized and absolutely focused on the job in hand, at the strategic, the operational, and the very tactical level. The same people that were in that room that we described in question 2, who made the decisions, who bring along the spirit of the agreement, have got to be in those meetings when the first 2, 3, 4, 6, 9 months moving through to business as usual of the contract are absolutely critical to the spirit and the success of the program itself, whether it's a long-term project or whether it's slightly more mid-term. So within that, communication has to be transparent. You've got to be embedding yourself with the vendor, I would recommend, whether that be onshore, nearshore, or offshore. It really doesn't matter. But investing the time, the travel expense, the time out of the retained organization, the buy-side teams will benefit from the access to their new partners. They will build such strong relationships, which will go on for many, many years, incidentally, and really do bring out the value in the project as well. So it's all about the governance, and it's also about optimizing the outcomes, making sure that deadlines are hit, any issues are escalated, not for blame, but for solutioning, and that may need to be escalated to the steercos. So we've got to ask ourselves, do we have a governance program that is alive? It has the right people in place. They have decision-making power. They are empowered to get on with things. And where appropriate, bigger issues that's a little bit more thorny that weren't foreseeable at the contracting stage or the scoping stage can be overcome. So those would be my sort of headline indicators of success in the governance program. And I'd like to hand over to Maureen to see what she thinks and what she would like to add.
Yeah, great, Leo. I agree with those. And I think also Steve made a comment in one of the prior answers about don't tell the service provider how to do what they're doing. It's really about managing outcomes. And quite frankly, we see with clients, that's a big change to go from I own the process, I manage it, my team executes it, I understand how it all works, to managing outcomes. And so really looking at the appropriate skill sets and who are the right people for the governance team over time. You know, it's challenging when you go from transition to governance, ongoing governance, because during transition, you know, your team, your internal team, your global process owners, they're the ones who are really helping solve the problems because they know these processes in intricate detail. And at some point, those scales tip over to where the service provider becomes the one with the ongoing institutional knowledge of your processes, and sort of, you know, how to kind of elegantly make that transition from owning it to managing the outcomes is tricky for a lot of clients. But, you know, a couple things to keep in mind. You know, one is making sure that as your retained organization may turn over time, making sure that whoever is interfacing with your service provider is really clear on who does what to whom. We talked early on, I think Steve mentioned, having those SOWs and understanding exactly who does what to whom is really critical, but making sure that people are kept up to speed on what that is so that you don't end up with scope creep over time or unwanted scope creep. And then I think the last comment I think I'd add to this, Leo, is conducting periodic benchmarking. So if you have a benchmarking clause in your contract, it's kind of a nice way to go back in and making sure that you know, that the pricing and the performance is meeting market standards as well.
Thank you, Maureen. So we're halfway through. We've got past question 3. One thing I just want to mention at this point is that if anybody wants to carry this conversation on at the end of the webinar, we will be providing this presentation and access to the people that have been involved through an online community, which I'll give you details about at the end. And I rather hope that anybody that wants to participate in that, you can start sharing content that helps with some of these things. You know, what communication tools do you use? How do you write an outcome? What does an RFP document look like? If you want to share that kind of stuff afterwards, we'll be showing you how you can do that in due course. Okay, so question 4. When all my outsourcers' KPIs are green, why are my internal customers still unhappy? And let's face it, that happens outside of outsourcing as well. Maureen, perhaps you could start with that one. Sure,
I'll start with this one. Boy, I wish I had, as they say, I wish I had $1 for every time I heard this from clients. So, you know, there's probably a couple things that could be contributing to this situation. You know, it could be that, you know, in the beginning through the RFP process, the KPIs and SLAs maybe weren't properly established. Either not enough time preparing them or really understanding, you know, the meaning and the importance of the KPIs and SLAs to the business. It could be that they were never modified over the life of the agreement. So somebody said early on that, you know, you can't be expected day one of your relationship to anticipate all of your business changes over the course of the agreement. So, you know, making sure that you're keeping those fresh and current that reflect your current business strategy and level of importance of the various SLAs. The other thing that we find, if you really peel it back and understand what's going on with each of the SLAs, a lot of times we'll find that the suppliers actually have the right to stop the clock. So if they have, say, a 24-hour turnaround time on a particular thing, whether it's turning an invoice over or whatnot, and if they have the ability to stop the clock because there's some inaccuracies, there's incomplete information, they have to do some follow-up, and then when they all is said and done and they're able to restart the clock and finish, you may end up with 48 or 72 hours elapsed time, but they're actually showing green. And we find that is one of the key contributors. So, you know, making sure everyone is on the same page as to when they can stop the clock and for what reasons, and then if there's, you know, accuracy and errors, making sure you're addressing the root cause. because it's really when you step back and you take the customer's view of the service, you may have a disconnect from the service provider's view of the service. Steve, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, Maureen, if I've been to clients that, when I ask them, do you have any SLAs or KPIs that you use? And they've brought out 3 binders with over 800 of them, to which I was nonplussed. Almost as nonplussed as to some clients where I say, well, how do you measure success or failure of your deals? And they're like, well, we don't. I mean, we know whether our people are happy or not. So from one extreme to the other, right? So how do you find that balance? And also, don't forget, suppliers look at this as, here's the SOW of what they want done. Here's what it currently costs them. And here's the level of service they want. And that's how they figure out their pricing to the client. So at the beginning, KPIs are very important. And in some RFPs, there's a bonus malus system, so you get hit dinged if you don't deliver your SLAs or your KPIs, or you earn credits if you do deliver them. Quite honestly, at the end of the day, I don't want any money or credits back. I want the service. So one of the keys, one of the tricks is you can design the most beautiful SLAs and KPIs. I've seen many times that done where the client is emphatic about this. And I'll say, well, have you got a system that's already can deliver that information out of it? The information to track the numerator and the denominator on this service level? No, but we'll figure it out. Well, all of a sudden you find out 8 months down the road they still haven't been calculating service levels. So from my point of view, this is fraught with a lot of KPIs and service levels can be fraught with a lot of dangerous points, delays, unhappiness, and one of the things I always tell my clients is, and I work for suppliers just as much, is to manage by walking around. Great, you've got this sheet of paper that has green, amber, and red on it, but nothing suffices better, and it doesn't keep people happier than if you go visit sites and talk with people. So what do you think of the service? Just a simple open-ended question. And all of a sudden, you find that you're going to get a lot different story than you are with your pieces of paper with red, amber, and green on it. So I like management by walking around.
Lee, would you like to take that one? I'm interested particularly on some of the outcomes that people are looking for that perhaps they measure, and not just some of the KPIs. I don't know if you get into that very much.
No, we do, Steve, and it's a great question. And I agree with everything I've just heard here. First point I would make is that anybody who's looking at sourcing for the first time in their organization, never be afraid to renegotiate KPIs. Of course, you won't be doing that quarterly, but certainly they have to be movable because they have to match your business imperatives and the directions you go. And all of us have to face some really strong economic challenges, competitive challenges, and not least of all, technological disruption as well. So we're all in the real world here. But increasingly, we're seeing outcomes around, customer satisfaction scores. In a lot of our client relationships, deep client relationships are, that is the be-all and the end-all of the relationship. If we take away price, if everybody's happy with the pricing mechanisms and all that good negotiation that went on, it really is about winning customers and about retaining customers. And everything we do for our clients has to be largely driven around that. So our KPIs have to be very, very agile. They don't change all the time, but certainly they've got to point towards that outcome. And increasingly, it's about retaining good customers, and we've got to be doing all we can, whether it be in insurance, whether it be in utilities, banking, analytics, to drive that value. And if we're doing that, we're still going to change some things, but if things settle down and we can go again, and as strategic plans roll over 2 and 3 years, we will get into a much more even metronomic sort of adjustment to KPIs.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. So question 5, how can you renegotiate a deal that's already been signed? How do you proceed if you personally have picked up a junk contract Ed?
Well, first of all, I think you need to think about why it is that you're renegotiating before you can really come up with a strategy for this. And there's a difference between renegotiating a contract that well, one of the fundamental questions, first of all, is anybody breaching? In other words, is this something that you want to renegotiate because people aren't living up to the terms of the agreement? Or is it something that you want to renegotiate because everybody is living up to the terms of the agreement, but you're not satisfied with what's going on? You have to approach those a little bit differently, but they have the same root cause a lot of times. One thing I think that a lot of people miss in this entire process is the fact that your leverage position completely changes once the contract is signed. So when you're in the RFP process and you're going through the contract formation part of the deal, the leverage is really on the customer, right? Now, what I always tell people about leverage, and I think this is an important point because I don't think people really understand a lot of times how to use leverage correctly. Leverage should not be used to get terms that you wouldn't get other than being able to basically browbeat somebody into submission and getting a term from them. Because what happens is once you sign the contract, the leverage position changes, and now you have a contract that basically has a term in it. And when I say contract, by the way, I'm referring to the whole contract. I'm talking about the SOW, the SLAs, and the fee schedule. So you come in and you get pricing that you're able to negotiate because it's a very large deal, but the supplier is not really profitable. So you basically leverage the RFP process. You got them to agree to this. The problem is they can't perform at that price. Now, you could argue that they shouldn't have agreed to it because they're adults, but the problem is that you get yourself into the same position anyway, whether they should have agreed or not. The fact is that now you're stuck with a situation where you have a vendor who has pricing that doesn't work for them, and they're going to find a way to make the deal work because they can't be unprofitable in the long run. It just doesn't work as a business model. So you start to see failures coming around this way. Another thing that I think people miss is that you've got thousands of hours worth of consulting time, thousands of dollars per hour worth of consulting time on the other side of the table when you're a customer doing the RFP process. If you're asking for things and the vendor is pushing back, sometimes they're not pushing back because they can't do what you're asking for. They're pushing back because you're asking them to actually do something that's not in your best interest. And building a learning process into the RFP process can help to alleviate some of this. Now, the reason that I mention this is because now you've got this contract that you have, and you want to renegotiate it. And the sort of knee-jerk reaction to this is to look at all the places in the contract that might be quote unquote weak, and try to strengthen them. So, if your SLA was 90%, make it 95%. If your SLA at-risk pool was 10%, make it 12%. Whatever it is, there's a lot of gap filling that tends to happen in renegotiating a contract. The question that I always pose, and I think requires, it's an interesting thought exercise, is when you're renegotiating a contract, is the reason that the contract is failing because the contract is too tough, or it is not tough enough, or is it because it's too tough? Right? If you have terms in a contract that somebody can't live with, you end up with death spirals happening. Does it make more sense to make those terms more rigid, or does it make more sense to look at what the root cause of the failure is than to go back and try to address it? Is a vendor not performing because they're not bringing the resources to the table, or is the vendor not performing because you're incapable of going through the amount of change that's required in order for the implementation to take place? I think these are all questions that really need to be asked before you can get into a renegotiation process. Because unless you get to the root cause of what the issues are, you have a whole bunch of shadow requirements. You went out to RFP and you defined everything that you wanted. The problem is that what people expressed wasn't really what they wanted. You thought that you wanted to do a data center deal with IBM, but what you were really looking for is a partner in innovation. But that doesn't get into the contract. But taking that example, then you have some governance terms that make the innovation impossible. For example, if you have something in there that says that the account manager can't be on commission, right, which completely removes their incentive to bring solutions to the table. So I think you really need to sort of look at what the root cause of the issues are if you're going into a renegotiation, and kind of work it from there. But open your mind to the idea that it may not be that you have to just do gap filling. It may be that you have to actually change some of the structural elements in the contract to make it work from an economic and from a business sense. And Leo, I imagine you have some views on this.
Thank you. I do, and everything you said there is actually top drawer value there. But I would be very disappointed if I was on the buyer's side and I picked up a junk contract. You know, why hadn't it evolved? Why hadn't the vendor move with the times, move with the changes in the organization for whatever reason? Did the vendor management team do a good enough job in articulating, communicating, changing needs and requirements? Because I'm always of the opinion that contracts are always being renegotiated. They evolve. Sometimes we don't want seismic change. It's frightening. It's disturbing. It makes us very, very, it makes us risk averse. We are risk averse animals in business, but sometimes it has to happen. But you can bring your vendor with you and vice versa in changing capabilities, changing tools and technologies, but ultimately a changing strategic objective. So, I would be disappointed if, we would a junk contract, and all of the people in the industry, all the vendors will work very hard to bring that a currency, to make it very, very current, to make it a living relationship. So use the governance model we've discussed in almost all the questions, I think, that today. Use benchmarking. If you really want to go external and get independent views on whether it's a junk contract or just needs some overhauling and a repaint and a bit of a tune-up, then certainly with the vendor, go and find a benchmarking firm and work through some objective targets that test some of the processes that are being delivered, and then come back and work on bringing the value back into the contract. So I think that's what I would add, finally to this.
Okay. I have a supplementary question that has come in, which I'd quite like to ask you around this, and then get Steve's view on it as well. If your definitions in the contract are too high level, I think some people sometimes get the feeling that anything they want is going to be out of scope and it's going to cost them a lot of money. So there's a question of how do you make sure in your contract that the service is defined in a way where there are no missed expectations there. And the second part of that is, as a service provider, how do you get into a relationship from your side? Perhaps Steve could answer the first one, you could answer this one, to ensure that you keep offering as much creativity and thoughtfulness and passion into the contract, when it's kind of mid-term.
Before I answer that question, Steve, let me go back and talk to something that Ed already talked about. Ed kept mentioning root cause, which is a great thing. One of the things I always do, because it's always difficult to figure out whether it was the client's fault, supplier's fault, what's as you said, the root cause. And just as a small tip to our listening audience, use the 5 whys. So when they say we really want to renegotiate this contract, whether it's the supplier or the client, I ask, why is that? Well, they just don't have the capability to deliver the change that we've agreed to in the contract. Why do you think that is? Well, we don't think they have the right people. Well, you understand what I'm saying. So the 5 whys is a very simple way to drill down quickly to figure out whether you have termination for convenience or whether you have a contract that should be renegotiated. Because the contract can always be terminated in part or in whole, or for convenience, because those are part of all the 50 ways to leave your lover in the MSA. But try the 5 whys first and figure out what the root cause is, as Ed suggested. And Steve Standring, back to your additional question. What was the question you asked?
Well, the first one there would be for you, Steve. If the contract service definitions are too high level, or soft as Ed would call them, I think some people feel or have experienced that whenever they want something out of the relationship, it seems to be out of scope, and they end up paying a lot more money for it. How do you make sure that you get those things defined so that the focus is on the outcome of the service rather than some of the little details that end up costing a lot more money?
Now, there's a lot of moving parts to that question, and by that I mean it's everything we've touched on today so far. Actually, you have to have the right legal advice and support. You've got to have the right advisor. If you've done it already internally within your company, one of those people should be, or 2 of those people should be on your team negotiating the new deal. It's about getting everybody together to ensure that lessons learned, knowledge that you have, advice of others, and then you can come to an effective decision, I think, in figuring that out.
Yeah,
So let me chime in here just for 1 minute on the on that question, because there's a fairly simple technique also that you can use to help this. When you're drafting SOWs, a lot of times you'll see these SOWs drafted as a list of tasks, right? You'll see RACI charts and you'll see tasks that are basically broken down into individual functions. What you don't see a lot of times is wrapper language around that actually describes what those tasks are meant to accomplish. So where you find people getting wrapped around the axle a lot of times is you have a list of tasks there, but you haven't either you haven't thought of everything, or everything ends up going back to the customer that's not included within that list of tasks. What's extremely helpful is to have some language up the top of those tasks that basically says something to the effect of service provider is going to provide all of the tasks necessary in order to be able to X. And then you figure out what X is. What that does is it basically forces people, when they're sitting at the table negotiating these things, to actually have a meeting of the minds about what it is that the parties are doing for each other. Instead of being in a situation where you can just check off a bunch of tasks, if the tasks are complete, then the service is done. That doesn't make any sense at all in an outsourcing contract, because those tasks may change with new technologies that are introduced, new business requirements that come from outside the contract. So it's very important to have that wrapper language at the beginning of this, and that really, really helps to sort of align people on what it is that they're expecting from each other as the contract, basically evolves over time. Sorry about jumping in.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, that was great. That was great. I'm going to actually, that's a nice segue into our last question, actually, which is how do contracts stay live when you're considering new innovation and tools? How can you make sure that your BPO is reliable enough to introduce you to new technologies and keep you current? And that kind of harks back to the question that I just didn't ask you, Leo. So if you could start with that, and I think a lot of people feel that once the contract started, are there ever conflicts of interest with a BPO which would prohibit you wanting to put new technologies in and become more efficient or more effective? We hear rumors that sometimes that happens. And just your view on how you create a relationship, I guess, where innovation and everything else is carried on through the contract term.
Sure, thanks, Steve. And I'll bring in Ed and Maureen and Steve on this as well. This is a critical question and a great close, I think. I think the success criteria, when in selecting, we talked about it 3 or 4 slides back, 4 questions back, selecting your vendor is to make sure you're asking the question, do these people understand my industry? Will they come to terms and understand, to a lesser or greater degree, my business? And that's so, so important. And then from the domain, and when you're kicking the tires and investigating whether they are truly investing in your insurance world or your retail banking world, then once you've said yes and that ticks the box, then you should start to see very, very quickly, once you reach BAU and beyond, and you start to get into some of those transformational journeys and outcomes that you so much wish for and bank upon in the scope and the reason for going to spend your margin and invest in the BPO relationship, then it should flow through to the relationship and the capability from the supplier to you. And I think that's critical. And so the domain is everything, in my opinion, here. Equally, there's got to be a concept change between just looking for a good supplier. I and my team now is using a phrase called, let's find a good customer. Let's find a good client. And that doesn't mean everybody rolls over and pays vastly inflated prices because they couldn't negotiate the contract. Not at all. What we're looking for is that engagement. And if the buyer truly wants to move into a rich and deeper relationship heading towards a partnership, and they take time, then they've got to be willing to set aside the time and invest the intellectual capital in that relationship. And that allows parallel running, in some cases, testing new hypotheses, testing new capabilities in a very safe environment, and putting the time and the investment of the right people in place from the buyer's team with the vendor to try and collaborate and work on some step changes that can actually mean a lot of value creation and a much faster realization to the benefits that you've so wished for in the contract negotiation. So it's that move to produce a good supplier and a good customer that's really important. We talked
Leo,
earlier on about... Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so just a quick question there. Would you recommend that your clients build this process and scope it in as part of the budget of the contract?
I would, but I think a lot of it can be covered in the governance model. Once you've moved to business as usual, in the first months of the contract, you'll be having governance calls daily, weekly, and so on. But once it starts to reach some sort of equilibrium where it's safely transitioned, safely process transfer, whether it's onshore or wherever, then you can start to build into your governance sessions. And I would suggest that 60% of the governance interaction should be around the next 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months of your business, and testing the imagination, the creativity, and the willingness to invest of your vendor, and getting into that comfort zone where, in a safe environment of just a boardroom or a project workshop room in their sites anywhere in the world, that you can actually venture some of these blue sky ideas, which may not come to fruition in the short term, but certainly you want to be testing some of this longer term, proactive, challenging views from your vendor. Once that clicks in place, then you'll be able to create the value that you want, and it should overcome some of the challenges we recently about the junk type of contracts. So I think largely the cost of that, the investment of that, will be covered in the governance model. But let's be serious. I mean, some things will hit us from the left field, and we've got to adjust and recover from it, or at least collaborate with, especially in the regulated markets. Then there will have to be an extra investment. But you'd be looking to try and recover most of that, if not all, and some, from the benefits brought in by technology, the tools, the disruptive plays that are coming into bear now, with the converging tool sets that are available. And it's a great time to be a buyer, and you should be setting a very high bar with your vendors to bring all of that to play in the relationship. And it probably won't happen in that first few months or year or so until you find that business as usual. But there will be some quick wins, which are risk mitigated, that will really drive the relationship very, very well. So that's all I would have to say so far. I'd like to hand over to Ed now and to see what views he has.
Well, I think, first I think that you position this discussion extraordinarily well, because all the things that you talked about are absolutely spot on. From a higher level philosophical point of view, if I may, one thing I think that I talk about a lot, and I think is really important to think about, is that there's a difference between deal financials and deal economics. And if you think about the way that the economic drivers, so financials is about money, and financials is certainly part of economics. But economics is a behavioral science, and it's about how you allocate scarce resources. So one of the questions that you need to really think about is, once you settle into the business as usual part of your deal, what happens economically at that point? And what I mean by that is, where do people's incentives lie? So what typically happens is, when you settle into the business as usual, if everything is going well, the vendor's incentive in that particular situation is to provide the services exactly as they are, and to start to minimize the amount that it costs them to provide the services. And the buyer has the exact opposite. They want to be able to receive the services, and they want to minimize their cost of receiving, and they want to actually maximize the services that they get for the dollar that they spend. So the question comes up, really, how do you get innovation to work when, really, when you think about it, the economic drivers in a deal don't really encourage innovation. The economic drivers in a deal actually encourage business as usual and cost decreases. So keeping a customer excited, keeping a vendor excited about doing business with you is actually pretty important. And one place to look to is the fee schedule. You see a lot of times there'll be clauses in contracts, and I think it's lots of times clauses in contracts that specifically say the things that you want are actually easy way out from doing the hard work that's involved in actually setting up the environment that you need to have the result happen. So how often do you see governance clauses in a contract that talk about innovation leads and talk about, I even had one time that I was looking at where they talked about monthly ideation sessions and things like that. So it's all really interesting, but what you'll find a lot of times is that your fee schedule actually sets up in an environment that discourages innovation. So what you need to really, I mean, one of the things that you have to do, in addition to everything that's been talked about, is really give a hard look at the fee schedule and really give a hard look at the SLA schedule to see if what you've actually done is set up an environment where the vendor really can't innovate because they really can't move off of what they're doing or think about things differently without getting themselves into trouble either financially or performance-wise. I bet you Maureen probably has some comments on this.
Yeah, thanks. I do. I know you said you were going to take a philosophical view. I'm going to get a little more tactical. You know, as Ed mentioned, there is an inherent conflict, but you know, from a contract perspective, we would expect out of the gate that the supplier is going to commit to, you know, some year-over-year process improvements, and that can come from process reengineering, standardization, simplification, and some technology tools, whether it's workflow tools, OCR, things of that nature. That's sort of expected in the deal, that there's going to be some year-over-year, you know, call it 3% or whatever, improvement year-over-year. And that you should have line of sight to at the beginning of your agreement, and that should be baked into the contract to make sure, because honestly, I still see clients 3 years into a deal and then they still don't have access to OCR, which is table stakes in my opinion. But I think the broader question gets to the transformation and how do you get your supplier excited about that and whatnot. We see a lot of suppliers coming at this wanting, you know, joint investment on some of the transformation initiatives, which we understand. A lot of talk and hype about RPA, robotic process automation. And I think the advice we normally give is make sure you've exhausted all of your other automation tools at your disposal. So again, if it's, you know, setting up the effective process interface, system interfaces, process work, and the automation tools, make sure all of that is as clean as possible before taking a look at RPA. And we do agree that, you know, big transformation programs like RPA are going to sometimes require joint investment on both parties' part, but I think the comment that was made by Leo and Ed is, you know, that's really where your governance team comes into play. But I think out of the gate, making sure you have line of sight into CPI and how that's going to be achieved is really critical.
Thank you, Maureen. That's great.
I would add, this is Steve, I'd add a build on that. One of the things I would do, especially hearing RPA and tools and innovation, by the way, innovation requires articulation. None of these, and what I think you could set up in the contract, to Ed's point, is a framework. And the framework basically consists of, each of these are treated as a project, and each project has to have a business case. So once you look at mutual investments, it's got to be specific. I don't care whose money it is, but if you don't have a business case, you're not going to be able to figure out whether you succeed or fail, or whether you should actually even go ahead with it. You may decide to go ahead with it for the good of the company, just as you would expect smaller offices that are going to use the new standards. It's going to be more expensive for them because they use one person to do 16 different things. So being part of the quote-unquote standardization doesn't yield them a big benefit. But with any innovation or new tools, got to have the business case, and that drives your decision-making process. That'd be my comment.
Thank you very much, guys. Right, if anybody else has any questions they want to send in, I have a few questions here which I'm going to pass on to the panel now. As we are going to provide a forum for carrying these discussions on later on, there's no reason not to keep your questions coming. First question, guys, this is a nice tricky one for you. Does anybody on the panel have experience of managing the process of moving tasks and processes back from an outsourcer into the organization? And have they got any insights on how to do that, especially with focusing on retaining quality during the transition?
My comment to that would be, I suspect Ed has an opinion, Steve, on this as well. This should be part of your original contract. I mean, you know, you plan, you hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And part of that planning for the worst is in the original contract is continuity of service when if you transition, if you decide to in-source, if you terminate for convenience. You've got to have that all defined, the costs, how much help, what's going to be transferred back. It's an exhibit in your contract that should be very clearly defined. There should be no guesswork involved with this particular step. And it should not be a surprise for either party. The only surprise being that it might have to be executed against. I don't know, Ed, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, first of all, this can't be a surprise because contracts all have termination dates. And at the end of the term, you're always going to have to do something. You're either going to have to move over to a different supplier, you're going to have to renew the contract that you're in, or you have to bring it back in-house. So this absolutely shouldn't be a surprise because it has to happen. The place where you can get into some issues with this are, and it depends a lot, by the way, on what kind of deal it is. And unfortunately, the term outsourcing right now means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So if you're doing something that doesn't have economic rents, meaning that you haven't transferred all of your personnel who perform a task over to a vendor and now you have to get them back, that becomes a lot easier, right? Because you don't have to worry about capability. All that you have to worry about is either finding a different supplier who can do the same thing, or doing it yourself, which is not the same as if you're taking a business process function, taking your entire capability to do that function, moved it over to a provider who, by the way, was tasked with things like driving costs out of the environment. So you moved your people over there, and they've offshored 3/4 of them, and the other 1/4 of them have gone on to do other things in the company, and they've automated some of those processes, and some of those processes now are being run by proprietary systems. So it's a really hard question to answer the way that it was presented because it takes so many different forms. In that kind of a situation, the amount of preparation work that you did going into the deal on things like, do you have to be able to, let's say that this is something that you're actually really worried about and you're going to be offshoring. Did you think about maybe having to do the offshoring capacity as a captive so that you could just take over the captive? In the situation where you have a lot of people that are currently employed by you who are constantly improving systems and things like that, and they go over to a vendor, well, all of those improvements now become the vendor's intellectual property. When you get that back, even if you took the people back, you wouldn't necessarily be entitled to get back the intellectual property unless you provided that for that up front. So a lot of this is a question of really thinking through what your situation is going to be like, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now, what you need to make sure that you get back, and then thinking about laying the groundwork to get those things back early on. And it's not just people. Like I said, it could be intellectual property. It could be, it could be a whole host of things. So, but the answer to your question is yes, I have had this experience, and it served us actually pretty well that we thought a lot about this going in. Also, things like the way that you terminate a contract and your ability to get extension terms. Let's say that you have to go through a resourcing process. You may not be able to control exactly how much time that's going to take. So the ability to have some flexibility on how the termination works and your ability to extend that is a big help. There are a lot of those kinds of issues that come into this that you could actually do an entire class on that if you wanted to someday, because there's a lot to that question.
Okay. Leo, I'm sure, Leo, this has never happened to you. If you have any experience with this, I'd be interested to see what it's like from your side. And then Maureen, perhaps you could come in. I would imagine benchmarking is going to be a critical part of this process. So perhaps, Leo, you could have a thought about this and pass on to Maureen.
Yeah, certainly. Two scenarios where this has happened in my career. One is when you do have that leaned and transformed and much improved set of processes that really make it economically viable to send back and to repatriate, if you like to use the phrase. There are others, though, that when there is just, it can't be moved forward, the relationship isn't probably as productive as it could be, and both parties agree to make the change. Get your best people on both sides on that change program. It comes down to the people. You can't put new employees onto it. They've got to be people who have, deep knowledge of the processes that were transitioned and received on both sides, and just reverse engineer the whole process. You have to have your good people. Document all the processes which should be going on in the lifetime of the contract anyway. Make sure there's that transparency around around that, and at the same time, you've still got to deliver business as usual with the outcomes that you contracted for. So, good people, some pace, care obviously, but pace and momentum to get the thing done, because it can be dispiriting on both sides, and helping the client have a soft landing, taking back their estate of processes that they've chosen to do so.
Thank you. Maureen, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, just a quick comment. So, you can repatriate everything or a subset of your processes for whatever reason. Maybe it hasn't worked out. So from a benchmarking perspective, if you've gone and benchmarked and you find that supplier can't meet market level pricing or quality commitments, there may be a need to bring that back or to go to yet another provider. But I think the key, and I think Leo just hit on it, is making sure that your desktop procedures and all your process documentation is completely current, because over time your supplier should have in some ways updated and transformed your processes, and to the extent that you now need to move that, if that documentation is not current, then it's going to be a disaster. And so we typically find that in every contract, and it's up to the governance team to make sure that the supplier is staying current with all of that documentation.
Thank you very much. Okay, just one question which relates back to the governance question that we had. How do you keep your governance program and managing the partnership to optimize outcomes? I've got a question here. And it's my sense as well that communication is critical in these relationships. And obviously, if you're offshoring, you're dealing with potentially different cultures, you're distant. Do you guys have experience, or the panel, do you have experience of kind of communication programs that you put in place to really make these things work? And specifically, any tools or structures or ways that you've had that have just been genius ideas that have worked really well? Perhaps you could take that one first, Leo.
A couple of tools that we use, tools or forums, if you like. One is creating a center of excellence under the domain banner that I described earlier on in the last question, and to really, looking at domain within a geography, within a jurisdiction, looking at the different compliancy levels and laws, the regulatory backdrop to the economy, and bringing that to life wherever those processes are being delivered by the client. That helps you on a number of levels. One is obviously the business economics and the business compliancy issue, but also some of the cultural things. How are you going to work with, I don't know, a US consumer who hasn't paid their electricity bill or their gas bill? How are you going to cope with someone in Britain who has that? Very, very different markets, very different cultures. But if you start to build this overarching domain capability and the center of excellence for each of the domains that you're delivering into the marketplace as a vendor, then that brings the client with you. And the client involvement in that is absolutely essential. So there's a number of outreach programs that we would run, and many other vendors do. There's cultural alignment, because cultural alignment has to happen on both sides of the table, both sides of oceans and continents. And finally, what we encourage is, and it's a great experience for some employee at the moment in a retained organization who wants to venture and spend some time working, creating value and learning new things in a different culture, go and join your vendor wherever they might be, even if it's near at home. Go and sit and have your offices there. Go and have your offices in the Philippines, in South Africa, in India, and go and experience a couple of years in the transition, the business as usual, and then into the really interesting things around transformation at your vendor site, and take on a key role in the leadership, because the vendor will be very quick to mimic and learn your culture and vice versa, and you can be a great ambassador and an evangelist to making sure that that contract succeeds.
Thank you, Lee. Can I pass it on to you, Steve?
Certainly. I mean, after Leo's answer, it's going to be hard. I'm going to be hard pressed to come up with a better one, right? But that's a good thing. I think communication, you basically follow the company's lead. The trick is making sure, from the beginning, that you've got the right client and right supplier together for this deal. That there's a want to communicate. In some corporations, communication at the executive level is the only communication that occurs. And at the worker bee, starting at even at the vice president and below level, you'll find that's a totally different type of communication. So you end up having to mirror the communication as a supplier that you're taking from your client. Now, if you have this sort of separation of rank and file in a company, it's very difficult to implement some of the programs Leo's mentioned. So what you have to be careful of is avoiding us and them. You've got to keep the senior executives happy, but you also got to keep the people that are responsible for doing the work. That's a very challenging communication environment to be successful in. The stories you always read in Harvard Business Review and those types of places, the things we've experienced in the work we've done in the companies we've worked at, is that what you end up seeing is it's always the wonderful success stories you hear, but you never hear about the failures. And just like in a marriage, without good communication, you're going to fail. If you're not setting the right expectations, it's just like an annual appraisal should just be the written confirmation of what you've been verbally hearing all through the year. If you don't have a good communication program from the beginning, you're not going to be very successful. You're going to have to be hard pressed to be successful.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I assume you're still married then, Steve?
No, actually, I use my ex-wife as examples in my negotiations all the time.
Right. Okay, we've got 2 minutes before I wrap up. I've just one question. This is a short and specific one. I've been asked, assuming that you've automated as much as possible internally, what's the average gain from RPA? Maureen, you might have some insight into that one.
And again, this is RPA is not as widely used yet as some might lead you to believe. So I think we're seeing, an uplift of about 10 to 15%. But of course, that's all predicated on, to your point, how well you've already automated and streamlined everything you can up until that point. So I think there's a lot of results yet to be seen on the actual benefits of RPA, but you really have to ask yourself, if you're automating the last piece of it through an RPA, why couldn't it be automated some other way first? So, again, exhausting all of your other tools at your disposal first.
Thank you. And Leo, can you 1 minute on that one?
Certainly, because that was a perfect answer. It's a new trend, and it all depends on the maturity of the processes in question. How far have they traveled in terms of transformation before you gave them to the vendor? If they're fairly new, then of course there's going to be bigger scope. So let's keep a level head. It's very exciting. It's energizing the industry and the buy side particularly. But let's be careful what we sign up for, because we've got to take the hype away and get down to reality, because ultimately, my company, we have to deliver against those expectations. And whilst we're not trying to pour cold water on it, we need to be sensible and businesslike.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody. That was fascinating. This is definitely something that we'll be following on through the year with other masterclass formats, because I think this is a good way of getting information across to everybody. Now, I did mention before that there was a way of continuing this conversation. We will send a link out to everybody probably tomorrow, but there is a new service that Shared Services is providing, which is at www.sharespace.digital, and it is a social media platform where you'll be able to join the community that's specific to this webinar. And I'm hoping that our panelists will be able to carry on conversing and answering your questions there, but it's also a place, as I said, where you can share content. So I would personally be delighted if anybody wants to share an RFP template for outsourcing. Also, anybody that's got any information around KPIs, we will drop some content into this community ourselves around the kind of KPIs that people are using today, just as a kind of a glossary. And as I said, I'm hoping if there's anything people have got out of interest, you know, outcome definition and anything to do with this subject matter, it would be a fantastic thing to share. You still own the IP on anything you share with us, but if other people update it and improve it, more power to the elbow is how we see it. Okay, so as I said, we'll send a link out tomorrow. In the meantime, coming up soon and available on details on sharedserviceslink.com are the webinars you can see here, rather nicely on robotics mentioned there as well. And we also have some conferences coming up. Okay, so I'd like to thank everybody for their attendance, and may the discussion carry on.